Now, if you spent any time learning about photography, which I'll assume you have, given that you're here, you'll know that it is full of rules, and YouTube is full of people like me that are talking about these rules all the time. But I believe that there's only one rule that you really need to follow, and it's the only rule that I pay particular attention to when it comes to my photography. If you saw my last video, you'll realise what a monumental achievement this is for me to be out with my camera today, because I just really haven't felt like doing this recently at all. But it's an absolutely beautiful day in the Peak District. I'm not convinced the conditions are perfect for getting really good photos, just because when the sun's out it's quite direct and harsh, and unfortunately I can't stick around until sunset because I've got a parents' evening, which is ill-timed, but I'm practicing what I preach. I'm trying to use time in the best possible way rather than make excuses for not going out. So I thought I'd make this video, and even though I'm in a t-shirt and the sun's out from time to time, it's not as warm as it looks. So before I get on to my all-important photography rule, first off, let's define what is a rule. And the Cambridge Dictionary defines a rule as an accepted principle or instruction that states that the way things are or should be done, and tells you what you are allowed or are not allowed to do. So it sounds like something that you have to do, and if you don't do it, the photography police will likely come and take you away. Either that, or you'll get trolled online by someone with too much time on their hands. Now I'd work better at 50mm. I have a film camera for that. I also have a 50mm lens on the Fuji, so we don't have to wait 11 weeks to get my film developed. This isn't stylistic. I want to shoot vertically and the peak gets in the way. Now, I'm guessing a lot of you are going to be familiar with all or many of these photography rules, but I'm just going to show you some examples, which is why I'm back here to demonstrate them. So the first one is, I'm sure, obvious to everyone, and that is the rule of thirds. And please excuse my inaccurate drawing. Now, the next one is the use of leading lines. The use of symmetry is another popular one. Now, this next one I don't use too much, but it's framing. So using things to act as a natural frame within your image. Filling the frame is one that I quite like to use, and this works well in woodland. You basically fill in the frame with a single subject to eliminate distractions. The next one is balance, and balancing your images can be a really cool tool. So here I've balanced these hikers against the big mountain here, which kind of anchors the frame a little bit better. The next rule is minimizing background distractions, which I've done in this image here. You've obviously got a subject here, but all of this space is very undistracting. The next one I don't pay too much attention to, but it is considered a really key compositional rule, and it is the golden ratio, as demonstrated here. Then we've got the use of depth of field, whether that be a shallow depth of field or using a large depth of field to make sure everything's sharp front to back. Then there's the use of light and shadow. There's the choice of aspect ratio, and then there's loads more, but the last one I'm going to mention is the use of perspective and angles, which is key to get a grip with when you're learning photography. Well, parents' evening went well, but it was a shame to miss the sunset, which from home looked pretty good, but it has meant that I've got back out this morning and I wasn't expecting this. So this is a really nice surprise for it to be a bit foggy here, because it was completely clear back at home. But anyway, back to the rules. Now, as I suggested, all of these rules that I've just spoken about aren't actually rules at all, because if they were rules, we'd have to follow them, and trying to do all of those within a single frame would probably mean we get pretty hacked off and frustrated with photography rather quickly. I love this scene with the bend in the road here. I had no idea this was even here. This isn't what I'm in location for. I need to head off down the road there, but I'm going to shoot this I've already shot it on this. I'm going to probably shoot it on the film camera as well. Although this is, like I said yesterday, a 50mm lens. Whoops. So I'm going to need to go back a bit. So whilst I am saying that we don't need to stick to these rules, I am not denying their usefulness. They are really good to know and be aware of, because if you implement them in the right scenarios, that will result in better photos. So what is this one rule that I think needs to be applied throughout photography? And it's actually pretty simple. Is it interesting? That's it. Every time you're taking a photo, just ask yourself, is it interesting? Let me explain. As photographers, we probably have the strongest connection with the image that we're making. I think that's reasonable to assume. So if something isn't interesting to us when we take it, we can't really expect it to be interesting to anyone else, to the viewer. And an immediate connection between the image and a viewer is essential for our images to get any kind of attention. A lot of us just do this for ourselves as a hobby, but really it is a nicer thing to do when people get enjoyment from our images as well. But once we've got the attention of the viewer, how we hold that attention is down to us and our skills as a photographer. Maybe we do that with interesting light or an interesting composition, or in the case of today, interesting weather conditions. So we can use these aforementioned rules that aren't rules, let's call them guidelines now, just to make things easier. We can use these guidelines to make the interesting thing more interesting from the viewer, which is why I guess they're important to be aware of and to keep in mind. I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in this, but every time I get into a situation like this, where the leaves aren't going to be like this for long, and the conditions aren't going to be like this for long, in fact I think they've probably ended already, there's a real sense in me that somehow I'm making a total mess of it. I think I'm about done in this location. There are only so many shots you can take of a row of trees. I'm going to go somewhere else where I'll talk about what makes things interesting. Before that, I just want to quickly say something else, because I was just walking back to my car and I obviously shot this earlier. And I think this is something that's quite important, because curiosity got the best of me, and I had a walk up there because I could see some kind of red kind of fence bollardy type things up there, and I had a wander up there, and there's been some subsidence and I think the road's closed, and I just think I've got some really kind of unique shots, especially in these conditions. And curiosity is such an important asset to make the most of as a photographer, and wondering what's going on and why it's going on and everything else led me to walk up there. I could have just got in my car and moved on, but I decided not to, and that led to me getting those shots, which are kind of interesting in their own right. Anyway, I'm going to go now to the next place. So, what makes something interesting? For me, that's harder to define than the rule itself. I guess it's something that you're immediately drawn to, or something that evokes some sort of emotion or feeling. And emotions and feelings are so important in photography, because they are what connect the viewer to the image. Maybe interesting means something unique. Photography has got so popular now that finding unique subjects to photograph is becoming more and more difficult, but it's a challenge that I've really enjoyed committing to, certainly earlier this year. Whilst I absolutely love amazing vistas and I love spending time in those kind of environments, I feel like those shots have been done so many times that it's really difficult to have a unique take on it without like really wild weather conditions or something like that. And I'm not having a go at anyone that wants to shoot these things. I just think because of the amount of images like that that we see, maybe that does just start to make them a little less interesting. I've been lucky enough to spend a bit of time with James Popsis recently, and his take on this, I think, resonates with me the most. An interesting photograph is one that, like I alluded to earlier, it prompts curiosity. It makes you ask questions. Just coming back to me here because I neglected to focus on my face for this bit. And what I was saying was, whenever you're out with your camera, when you raise it to your eye, before you hit that shutter button, just ask yourself, is this subject interesting? Because if it's not, it doesn't matter really how many of those other guidelines you follow. If it's not an interesting subject, it's unlikely to make an interesting photograph. Now, that's not to say that if you do find an interesting subject, it will make an interesting photograph. This is an example I shot yesterday, and to me this is quite an interesting subject, but I couldn't find any way of being able to turn that interesting subject into an interesting photograph. This one is another example. This looks to the eye like a really nice view, but there's just no way of turning it into an interesting photograph. Also, what's interesting to one person might not necessarily be interesting to another. Take this scene that I shot this morning. Some people will prefer the scene with the car in it, and some people will prefer the scene without the car in it, and some people won't really like either of them. And that's basically up to you as the photographer to decide what you want to show. And what you want to show shouldn't be based on what anyone wants to see. It should be based upon what you like to shoot and what you want your body of work to be. And if you're trying to chase things that other people might find interesting that you don't, that's probably the quickest way to burn out as a photographer, like I discussed in my last video. So that's basically what I do every time I put the camera to my eye. I ask myself, is it interesting? If it is interesting, I try and use the guidelines to make a more compelling image. And if it's not interesting, I just move on and see what else I can find. I'm not actually sure I've followed my own rule today though. I've not been out much with my camera recently. I'm trying to make a video. Peak autumn here in the Peak District. I've basically never seen it this good before. And I've probably just taken a lot of shots of rubbish, but hopefully there will be some that prove to be a little bit interesting.